Well, that was a wonderful introduction, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you, very kind. The book that's available in the lobby and included with the VIP ticket complements Meg Wheatley's presentation. So as I was listening to Meg last month, I was amazed at the parallels. The book is a compilation of essays and photographs of ordinary women in Yucatan, Mexico, doing extraordinary things. We discovered that women became leaders not because of courses or seminars or institutes, and not because something was in it for them, but because they just could not take it anymore. And so her remarks and what you would find in the book, there are just so many similarities, such as Margarita, a 23-year-old young woman with wonderful thick black hair who is leading an effort to get running water to her village. Her photograph is in the lobby. I always thought, when I was taking that picture, I was thinking, now how does she even wash her hair? You know, I mean, how does she get that done? And then if you notice, if you look at the picture, I didn't know it at the time, but her little brother is in the background. And so that's become one of my favorite photographs. The book describes themes that emerged among the 30 interviews. We wanted to know the women's motivation, their obstacles, how they overcame the obstacles, and their advice to other women. Interestingly, most of the women defined a leader as someone who moves something forward. They're always talking about move forward. Meg talked about a leader as someone who helps others. So I think you see the similarity, between helping and moving forward. And that keyword moving, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And I thought I would just share a few stories from that book, since it did kind of reflect Meg's, and then I'm going to talk more about the sages. The book was a 10-year journey from the beginning until the book was published. I didn't set out to write a book, I just set out to take a few photographs. My co-author, Dr. Georgianne Huck, said, we can do more than that. So we set out to find women who were making a significant difference in the lives of others. And for most of the women, they lived in a village with only one telephone per village, such as the photograph of Sabina. She's the one sitting in a hammock displayed in the lobby. When we started the project, I don't remember any of them having cell phones. Now, what's interesting is things have changed, and Mexico's so interesting in that way. You can find people who have cell phones, but they won't have running water. It's just so interesting. But at that time, we started this in 1998. Some of the women, we literally had to drive to find them. We interviewed them in Spanish, tape recorded the interviews, transcribed the interviews to the computer, then we had to pay to have somebody translate the interviews. So even though my co-author was fluent in Spanish, translating, is not her strength. So, I was carrying all kinds of, and again, I was using film, black and white film, carrying cameras and batteries, and lots of batteries, because batteries go dead in humidity. It was quite an experience. We had all kinds of adventures, such as our car breaking down, driving to the village 3 times, being told that Blanca would be there, and we would have to drive again. One of the other photographs in the lobby is of Isabel, and I like to tell Isabel's story. She's the one surrounded by men, and she's the director, which is very unusual. She's the director of the organization that makes furniture for people with disabilities. One of their main products is to take a motorcycle, cut it in half, put a cart on top of it, build a little ramp that slides into the cart, and then people who use wheelchairs just roll up and then just take off like they're on a motorcycle. Now, that's great in Mexico, not so great in Iowa, with our weather. But with the weather down there, it's one of their main products. But they also make other furniture, beds, and some chairs for people who use wheelchairs and who have disabilities. Well, Isabel was born with a disability that gradually took away her ability to walk. So she uses one of these carts. Now, Georgianne often collects money from people in the States and delivers it to either agencies or people who need it. So we were on our way to deliver money. Well, let me explain my relationship with Georgianne. She was my professor at Central College, and then I was on the faculty with her for another 20 years. Since she lives in Mexico and she's the former director of our Yucatan program, as I said, she's fluent in Spanish. Otherwise, this project, which ended up being that book, would have been impossible. But our personalities are totally different, I think, but we're interesting together. I often describe us as Lucy and Ethel, Laverne and Shirley, or Thelma and Louise, that's right. Laverne and Shirley and Thelma and Louise. So, back to Isabel. So we went to deliver the money. When we discovered that Isabel was the only woman in the agency and she was the director, I looked at Georgianne, and Georgianne said, "I know what you're thinking." And we were, no one else spoke English there, so Georgianne said, "I know what you're thinking, we should include her." And I said, "Well, I think we should include her." So Georgianne's like, "Okay." So she started to explain to Isabel what we were doing in this project, and Isabel went back to her office, came back, and she brought out these scrapbooks where she had been in the Olympics in Australia for people with disabilities, and she'd won medals, and so we definitely included her. So then, and Isabel, just because these women were leaders does not necessarily mean that they were photogenic. So some were, some weren't, and Isabel, she couldn't take a bad picture. So I had all these great pictures of Isabel, and as we were leaving, Isabel said, she said, and again, all this is in Spanish, but thank goodness Georgianne spoke Spanish. I'm a conversationalist, but she said to Georgianne, "Well, everybody wants to be in the picture. Can you take pictures of everyone?" So they all crowd in, including the dog, okay? And so then I take pictures, and everybody was so happy. And I like to tell the story where the dog's name was Solovino. And I love that. Solovino, Solovino. Well, it means he came alone. Now, I don't think we would name a dog he came alone, but Isabel said, "Well, he came alone." And he stayed. So it's, I love that. I mean, that's why I love Mexico, So I'll never forget that. Okay. And the other part about the story is Isabel had used a chair in the Olympics that the men in her agency had specially designed so that she could get a lot of, she was a javelin thrower, so she could get a lot of leverage, upper body, strength and leverage. So I like to tell that story. So tonight, I'm going to share with you stories about my quest to learn leadership, which I call In Search of Wisdom, What I Learned from Leadership Sages. And this quest has now become the book on which I'm currently writing. I'm going to talk about how the study began, because I always like that. I always like to know, now, how'd that study begin? How the study began and the method I used, and I'm going to share 4 of the more interesting life lessons or lessons learned for becoming better leaders at work, at home, and in the community. I started this research project when I was on sabbatical from Central College in 2004, 2005. Jim Collins, who's coming to town in June here, author of Built to Last, Good to Great, and now Great by Choice, he was giving a presentation at Drake, and some of you maybe even attended that. But I went along with a goal: I'm going to hang around and talk with them afterwards if I can and ask them some questions. So I hung around, and I asked him if we could have a telephone conversation. And it was kind of interesting because he kind of looked at me and he said, and this was 2004, he said, "Well, I charge $5,000 an hour." And I looked at him and I said, "Oh, really? Well, I work for a not-for-profit." And then I pulled out of my planner this article that he wrote for Training Magazine in 1999. It had his picture on it so you could see it. And I said, "And I love this article." And he said, "Okay, we'll talk. Call me." So I called him and he said, "I agree to talk to you for 1 hour. You have 1 hour of my time free." And I said, "I'll take it." So I was, busy talking. And basically he said, "Why don't you, leadership's your passion." He said, "So much is being written about leadership." He said, "But no one's tying it together. Everybody has a theory, 8 points, 7 points, 6 points, or principles." He said, "But who's tying it all together?" He said, "Why don't you be that person?" So at the same time, I was going through this program to be a saging leader, as Renee said, and which is just another word for positive aging, consciously aging. And our culture does not really appreciate our elders. But life experience can lead to wisdom if we process our life experience. And Meg Wheatley talked about this in Africa. I mean, people respect their elders much better in other cultures. And I've just always felt that people older than me with more life experience were wise, people from whom I could learn. So I went in search of sages, wise people, some of the prominent thought leaders in the field of leadership. And because the field is exploding, I narrowed my sample to leaders who advocated or believe in servant leadership. I wanted to learn from people who believe that they want to create a place where people can bring their mind, bodies, and souls, where they didn't have to check their souls at the door. And when times are tough, servant leaders still focus on being authentically honest and trying to maintain a humane workplace. Because I believe leaders should clear the obstacles for others. Leaders should not be the obstacles. I started with some of the most well-recognized leadership authors. Warren Bennis, actually it took me 3 years to contact Warren Bennis, and it was only because of Jim Autry, who's another one of my sages, that I was able to contact Warren Bennis, who's like probably 85 now and still teaches at USC. Peter Senge, the author of The Fifth Discipline, I interviewed him when he was in his car commuting to MIT, but I also went to a seminar with him, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And Sally Helgeson and Margaret Wheatley were two of my sages. I asked each of them who else I should interview, and that kind of set me on the journey. And I discovered kind of later that according to Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, I interviewed some of the top executive coaches in the country. Now, at the time, I didn't really know that. I kind of discovered that later, which was probably good. I might have been intimidated if I knew that at the time. I was just calling these people up. And with cell phones and email, you don't know where people live. And you don't often know exactly who they were since they were referred. And simultaneously, I was also interviewing senior leaders for what was called the International Center for Spirit at Work. It's now called the Tyson Center for Faith and Spirituality in the Workplace. But I was doing teleconference interviews with Judy Neal, who was the founder of this organization. And annually, they would recognize and select organizations that had applied for the Spirit at Work Award. So what I did then is I called senior leaders of organizations who had won that award to talk to them about how did they create that kind of culture. At this point, I've interviewed more than 100 sages. Most of the interviews were done over the phone, but I grabbed any chance I could to interview people in person at national conferences, or if I happen to be in the area, if I'm going somewhere in particular. We would be on vacation, and I would make an arrangement, plans to interview a sage. And I had only 5 questions, but I had 3 that I'm going to share with you, and then 1 that was a driving question. So my questions were, what do you consider to be the most significant works, books, articles in the area of leadership and or spirituality in the workplace? And when I use the word spirituality, I'm not talking about religion. It could include that, but I'm really talking about spirit, heart and soul. Number 2, what's your current thinking on the topics covered by these books or articles? And number 3, this was my driving question. How should management education be changed to be more effective for preparing people to be the kinds of leaders needed in the changing workplace? Depending on the answer, then I would probe for specifics. So whatever they would say, I would say, well, now how do you do that? And what else should I do? Or how can I make that happen? So I was always probing for specifics. After analyzing the data, several themes emerged. And out of those themes, I developed a leadership course, both at the undergraduate level and the graduate level, to share with students what I've learned from these sages. In fact, it's really fun because I'll hear from different students and they'll say, here's a sage you need to interview. I think I've got some of them hooked on the idea of sages too, and I do love that word, okay? And actually, just a little trivia, when the restaurant Sage went out of business, I bought the sign. So I have a neon sign that says Sage, but I just don't know where to hang it yet, okay? And I was pretty persistent about that, okay? But the biggest aha in all of this research was this. I asked them about leadership, and they told me about life. I've concluded that work-life balance really is a misnomer, that in this 24/7 world in which we live, boundaries really don't exist. So it's not about balance, but it's more about integration. Work that is fulfilling gives our life meaning and a sense of purpose. And another aspect that I'm very passionate about is this whole idea of retirement. Because we're not retiring, we're moving on. And work gives people a sense of purpose. Now, it doesn't have to be paid work, you know? It could be whatever, I call it a calling. In fact, one of the advantages I had of picking up Sally Helgeson and Margaret Wheatley and taking them to and from the airport is I got to talk to them even more. And Margaret said, you know, you're on a calling, you know, and she said, you're being called, and this is what you're being called to contribute. So she said, it's really, how can you contribute your skills, talents, energy, that kind of thing. So, and actually one of my favorite sages, Richard Leiter, he's in Minneapolis, an executive coach in Minneapolis, but he's done research and he's concluded that meaning trumps money and significance trumps success. So that most people, regardless of age, in the end, really are looking for meaning and significance. They want to know that their life made a difference. So I've learned lessons from the sages, and as I learned this lesson, then I tried to integrate it into my life. And what I learned was that I was on this unexpected journey. And that's kind of what I'm writing about, and I'm going to share 4 of the lessons with you tonight. The first one is, the 4 lessons: awakening to oneself, confronting one's dark side, learning compassion through loss, and living a legacy. So the first one, awakening to oneself. We often hear about self-knowledge, self-insight, and all of that's important. And we often think, well, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Well, this was a little different. This was about, you know, the most important person to lead is ourself. So how do we find our authentic self? So this involves talking about being present, awake, and mindful. And when I would ask the sages about this, they'd say, well, you need to find, you know, you need to help your students, or you need to find a place where, you know, where you can listen to the silence and listen to your inner voice. So several of the sages talked about going on retreats in order to know yourself. And actually, I can share just a little story here. So I was at a soccer game. Our kids were in high school, and I was at a soccer game, and I started talking about retreats. And I wanted to go, and one of my friends said, well, her husband wasn't there. He was on a retreat. I said, well, I want to go on a retreat. And so I said, well, where did he go on a retreat? And she told me, and I said, well, I don't want to sound snobby, because many of the sages said, well, you need to find a monastery. And I said to this friend, I said, well, I don't want to sound snobby, but I want to go to a monastery. And another woman turned around, she said, well, I'm from Dubuque. You need to go to the New Melleray Abbey. That afternoon, I was on the phone, making an arrangement to go to the New Melleray Abbey. And so since 2004, which is in Dubuque, or close to Dubuque. So since 2004, I've been going once or twice a year. I look forward to it. But I like to tell the story. When I first told my husband I was doing this, he had 2 comments. And he said, I can't believe you can be silent for 3 days. You know, are you really going to be silent? And they make it very clear that, you know, people are here on a silent retreat, respect the silence of others. And then he said, and this has got to be cheaper than a spa. And it is. So, but I've been going so long that now I've come to know some of the monks. But the idea is to be comfortable with just being ourselves, with ourselves, and in order to be our best person, to really have a place where you can hear yourself think. And actually another chapter in the book that I'm not going to talk about tonight, but I talk about disconnecting to connect. You know, that we really do need to unplug if we're going to, and be in silence, so we can hear what we're thinking. Well, I shared this experience, or I was talking about it in a workshop I was doing with mid-level marketing managers from a telecom firm. And when I explained this monastery, and actually we were reading the book. I don't know if you read this book, but it's just called The Servant. And I got introduced to that book because Pella Corporation uses it with all of their people in management. And it's a parable story similar to, it's a little higher level than Who Moved the Cheese, but it's a parable, it's a story, and it's about a senior leader going off to a monastery. And so we were reading that book as part of this workshop, and this mid-manager said, "This is crazy. No way would I want to be with myself." And I thought, well, I don't know if I'm sinking in with this guy, but I had several thoughts. First of all, he has a lot of work to do. Secondly, he better get going. And third, I'm glad I'm not working for him. So part of this awaken to oneself, this whole idea of finding a place to be silent where you can get to know yourself, and another aspect that came through with the sages was this concept of mindfulness. Now, in 2004, 2005, when I was first introduced to this, it wasn't all that common. You're hearing more and more of it. Oprah, I think, made it popular with Eckhart Tolle and, the power of now and presence and all of that. But when I started this, it was pretty new to me. So mindfulness is just another way of being aware, paying attention to what we say and do. And it can be very difficult in these busy times where everyone wants something faster and multitasking is the norm. Although research on multitasking says that it's not as effective, that we really should focus. And I often say that the opposite of mindfulness is mindlessness. So if you're being mindless, we're not talking about that. We're talking about mindfulness. So, just a couple questions. How many times do we go through the day and we don't even remember breathing? Or how many times we don't even remember walking? Or the food that we eat. We've eaten dinner, and maybe it cost a lot of money, and we don't even remember eating it. Being mindful always involves slowing down and being intentional about what we say and do. Pause, breathe. This is not easy for me, and I'm constantly working on it. But sometimes in my leadership class, I just say, okay, we're going to stop and we're going to breathe. And at first, the students, thought I was a little odd. But, then it kind of all comes together, and I hope that I connect the dots for them. But, this idea of we need to breathe. And if we pause and slow down, maybe we won't have to regret what we said or what we did. And again, this can help us at home, at work, in the community. So think about this. Go for a walk. Be aware of each step and each breath. This helps us become aware of the world around us. And I always like Caribou Coffee's motto, life is short, stay awake for it. So now it's time for audience participation, okay? What time is it? Now, I'm going to say that, and you're going to say now, right? Yeah. And where are we? And you're going to say here. So what time is it? Now. Where are we? Here. Where are we? Here. What time is it? Now. Yeah, I do that in class, don't I, Kate? I see a former student up there. I love that. And so I started doing that every time I walked into class. And what was interesting is a couple of students would say to me, you didn't do that today, you forgot, So they're paying attention. I think they're paying attention. And I use that exercise to get people grounded. And so finding a place for silence, listening to ourselves, being present, mindful, awake, important leadership practice. Number 2, confronting one's dark side. How many of you have worked for a bad boss sometime in your life? Okay? Working America has a website. It's just workingamerica.org. But they have a website, and interestingly, they have an annual event called My Bad Boss Contest. Now, just Google, if you can't remember anything, just Google Bad Boss Contest, okay? This is an opportunity for workers to speak out about the difficulties they face every day on the job. Anyone and everyone's encouraged to share their story about a nightmare boss in order to be eligible to win a well-deserved week-long vacation. The stories are posted anonymously on the website, and I've shared these stories in a variety of settings with students, workshop participants, as illustrations of the dark side of leadership or the shadow side. If people knew themselves and their blind spots, there would be fewer horror stories to share on this Bad Boss Contest website. The stories go on, and they're evidence that there's a lack of insight and awakening of many bosses. If bad bosses were not so common, people would not relate to a movie titled Horrible Bosses. if you've seen that movie. Now they're talking about a sequel, okay? I mean, the movie's almost scary if you've had a bad boss, okay? I also think that part of the premise of the television show Undercover Boss, you know, what they're trying to do is workers are trying to communicate what it's like to work here. You know, give us a chance to talk. Ask us questions. We'll tell you. As a person who believes in continuous improvement, you need to give feedback. You need to give it, you need to receive it, and you need to be open to it. One of my favorite definitions of leadership came from a workshop I attended with Peter Senge at MIT. He reminded us that leaders should inspire. Notice, inspired to inspire. I love the tagline here. He reminded us that leaders should inspire, and the root word spire means breath. So leaders, Senge said, should breathe life into people, places, and projects. And I've used that definition in a lot of different ways. But the shadow side of leadership causes us to breathe in dead air and takes away our breath. We feel as if we are choking when the person comes around. People are afraid of everything, and many people are asleep at work. They're sleepwalking through the day. And this is coming out, and they're suffering. It's coming out with panic, depression, chronic worrying, disease. I mean, just not good signs. And suffering has many costumes. It can be anger, arrogance, frustration. All of this is a leadership issue because it creates an unhealthy work environment, or sometimes called toxic workplaces. Now, the ego can cause the dark side to emerge. I was familiar with using the term egotistical as a way to describe someone who's self-centered or inflated, has an inflated opinion of themselves, but I really did not understand how ego affects our thoughts, behaviors, and decisions. So understanding ego development is critical to confronting one's dark side or shadow. And I say, we all have an ego. We need to have an ego. But we have to keep it in balance and we have to keep it in check. And so when you're really aware of this, you sense it creeping up. And usually the dark side manifests itself in greed, jealousy, micromanaging, you know, these negative traits that drive others crazy. When we feel it creeping up, sometimes I like to use a metaphor of elevators or something. You feel it going up, you need to say to yourself, okay, you need to acknowledge it. Okay, I mean, it happens. Someone got a promotion you didn't get, an article published, you know, whatever. So interestingly, early in my research, I was so immersed in studying this that whenever I would hear or use the word leader or leadership, I was just always positive. I was always thinking of positive terms. It was not until one of my sages, this James Hunter, who wrote the book The Servant, that's written like a story, reminded me, he said, Jan, this is not about being a leader. He said, the question we should be asking ourselves, are we an effective leader? Are people better off because we are their leaders? There are a lot of people in leadership positions who are not good leaders. To me, that was a huge aha, because I was so gung-ho leadership. But when he said that, I'm like, of course. So why are there so many bad leaders? So what I discovered is if I'm going to learn about leaders or good leaders, I needed to learn about what makes people bad leaders. And that involved understanding the power of the ego and that what I call the dark side or shadow. So I went on a 4-day retreat with a person named Dan Peterson, and he's an executive coach and he's one of my sages. And I went on this retreat to learn about ego development. Now, he came recommended from someone else who was pretty high-powered, but the other kind of selling point on him was very difficult to get to. It was in a very remote part of Colorado. So I had to fly into Denver and then take this very small plane to his, I didn't know you could own a canyon. He owns 4 canyons, but I suppose it's like a farm. You know, I mean, he owns land and there are 4 canyons on his land, but the name of his, it's called Sage Canyon. I said, that's a sign, I have to go. I have to go, it's called Sage Canyon. But he was very wise, and I liked this. Dan's definition of ego, he said it's the difference between what you want to have happen and what is happening. It's the gap between what we want and what is. When we learn to let go of the difference, we are controlling the ego and not letting the ego control us.